Welcome, everyone. It's so great to see your wonderful faces and names from advocates across the state who are committed to our clean energy goals, to making our climate plan real. We're very excited to be here today to talk specifically about how we're going to achieve our goals in the power sector. So we have some, great experts and advocates, including Anne Reynolds, who many of you know. Anne is the executive director of Alliance for Clean Energy New York and was actually a member of the Climate Action Council. So helped come up with our plan to make the CLCPA real. So we're going to hear from Anne about the latest on meeting the Climate Act 70 by 30 targets. Then we're going to hear from Adrienne Esposito. Adrienne, who is the ED of Citizens Campaign for the Environment, a longtime environmental advocate, and has been doing incredible work to build out offshore wind on Long Island. So we're going to hear about the recent victories and setbacks there. Then Luke Falk, who is the COO of Clean Path New York for energyRe. And Luke's going to be presenting on that project specifically, but then sort of this bigger picture of the critical role of transmission, which I think we don't talk enough about when it comes to the clean energy transition, why it's so important. And then last but definitely not least, we're going to hear from Dan Haas, who is the co-chair of Friends of Columbia Solar. And Dan's going to be talking about how we can take action to support large-scale solar on the ground, and specifically the Shepherd's Run project. We're really excited to have all of these advocates and experts here, and especially Dan, who is actively working in his community to support renewables. So thank you all so much for being here. A little housekeeping, which I'm sure everyone knows by now, is just, put your questions or comments in the chat. And we will get to them at the end. Also, if we don't get to your question, and if we don't have time, hopefully we will. We really want to make these interactive, and we can even call on people if you'd rather that, but people often just want to put their question in the chat as they're thinking of it, and then we'll come back to it at the end. But if we don't get to it, we will capture everybody's question in a Google Doc, and we will make sure to have our experts and advocates answer those questions, and we'll send them out with the recording as soon as possible. I have, great team members here who will make that happen, including Bryn Fuller-Becker, who you probably recognize the name if you're on NYCP's mailing list. Bryn sends out all of our emails and, make sure that we're all in the know with the latest in what's happening in the clean energy transition. So with no further ado, I will pass it over to Anne Reynolds, the ED of Alliance for Clean Energy New York and a council member of the Climate Action Council. So Anne, thank you so much for all of your amazing work over the years, fighting for a cleaner, greener environment and to decarbonize our state and specifically our power sector. So
for the introduction, and it looks like we've got an even 100 people on this call now. So that's excellent. I'm just going to spend the next 10 minutes chatting with you about how New York is doing reaching 70 by 30. So before I launch into that, though, as Betta said, 70% of the electricity being from renewable sources in New York by 2030 is one of many goals that are enumerated in the climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. So today we're just going to focus on that one, reaching 70% by 2030. But part of my message is that goal is really the foundation of all of the others. So there's goals in there about reaching zero emissions by 2040 from the electric sector. Unless we can get to 70 by 30, we're not going to be able to go that next step to 100% zero emissions by 2040. There's economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, and the way we're going to get to them is by electrifying transportation as much as possible and electrifying home heating and building heating and commercial space heating. But when we do that, the reason it reduces emissions is because that electricity that will be powering our cars and heating our homes will be renewable. So unless, again, we get to these renewable energy goals in the electric sector, we can't build on that to get to the rest of the goals in the climate law. So I'm going to structure my remarks about good news, bad news, and some conclusions. And if you follow electricity policy and climate action policy in New York, which I'm assuming, you know, this is a very informed and educated audience about those topics. If you've been following it in the last month or 3 months or 6 months in New York and nationally, there's a lot of confusing news. Because you can get one day some headlines about renewable investments are at an all-time high. The amount of wind power that came online is at an all-time high. And yet there's a lot of bad news about major projects getting canceled and difficulties getting solar panels and getting manufacturing going in the United States. So it really is a good news and bad news kind of story. So it's an interesting time to talk about the status of reaching 70%. So let me start with the good news. We have 29% renewable energy in New York State right now. So our challenge is to go from 29% to 70% in just 7 years. And that's super ambitious. I've been working in this field for many years in New York, and basically in the course of my time in Albany, we've moved the needle from 24% renewables to 29% renewables. It's moving in the right direction, but way too slow to meet the goals in the climate law. So that needs to be accelerated. I guess I haven't gotten to the good news yet. That's still the goal. If we turn back the clock to last April, Earth Day, Governor Hochul put out a press release about some renewable energy projects. It seems so long ago now, but it's worth reflecting on what it said. It said that in the previous 6 months, 8 new large-scale renewable energy projects came online in New York State, and that was a record. That was a faster pace than ever before, and it consisted of both upstate land-based wind projects and what we call grid-scale solar projects. So it didn't include solar on rooftops or community-sized solar projects, which are also extremely important. This was focused just on large-scale renewables that are selling their power through the wholesale market, and so connecting into the grid and providing electricity to the grid. So that was fantastic news. Just that group of 8 projects created 1,800 jobs, mostly construction jobs, brought $800 million in private investment to the state, and is providing $70 million to host communities, the towns that these projects are located in. Over that $70 million is over the course of their contracts with NYCP, which is 20 years. So it was a very happy occasion. I was at the press event, and if we had maintained that historic level of new projects coming online, we still would not get to 70 by 30. But if we get to the point where about 25 projects reach operation each year, you know, we would from a upstate wind and solar point of view, plus offshore wind, plus some transmission projects, you know, we could get to that goal. So it was very great news that we are on the upswing in terms of projects actually reaching operation. Just to give a little bit of flavor to that, it was a 20 megawatt solar project in central New York, 2 20 megawatt solar projects in the Mohawk Valley, a small hydro project and a large wind project in the North Country, and 2 wind projects in the southern tier, and also a solar project in the southern tier. So these projects are where there is open land and where there is wind, in the case of wind power. they're spread out across the state, but they're not downstate in the metropolitan area. So, and that's an important feature of New York's challenge in getting to 70%. At the same time, the first offshore wind project to serve New York State started construction. It's under construction right now. The South Fork Wind Project. It's going to connect into the east end of Long Island, and it will be the third offshore wind project to reach completion in the United States. There's 2 under construction now. Well, I guess maybe the one in Virginia started too. So another piece of great news, that South Fork Wind Farm is under construction. So we also have had a significant number of transmission projects approved. The organization I work for, ACE New York, has been lobbying hard for those. We didn't come to lobby for transmission for the sake of transmission itself. We came to the realization that building transmission in New York State is a climate action issue, because we need that transmission in order to deploy more renewables and to strengthen and make the grid more resilient for this transition in general. So there's a lot of good news to report there. The Inflation Reduction Act passed by the federal government is by far the most important piece of federal legislation to support the clean energy transition and climate action ever. So there was a lot of great headwinds, in the last 12 months, let's say. So let me shift over though to some of the bad news. That pace of developing large-scale renewables in New York came to a halt right around that time in April. And a lot of projects that were scheduled to start construction since then, or in 2023, have not started construction. And one of the interesting things from that group of projects that successfully reached operation, again, that group of projects, 8 of them in that previous 6 months, gave us an interesting window into what it really takes to get projects built. And all of those projects bid into NYCP 6 years before. So now we know in New York State, for reasons I could talk about for days on end, it takes a very long time to go from bidding in to get a contract with the state from NYCP to actually reaching operation. And to get a project built in New York, you need, think of it as 4 parallel processes. You need a contract with NYCP, you need an interconnection with the ISO who operates the grid. You need a permit from the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, and you need a tax agreement with your local communities. And if any of those 4 pieces don't come through, your project does not successfully reach construction. So we know from those projects that it takes 6 years from when you bid to when you build. It should be shorter, it's not. In that intervening 6 years, we had a pandemic, we had a war in Ukraine, which greatly increased demand from other European countries to transition to renewables rapidly. And we had increasing demand from renewables across the world, which is a good thing, but it really stressed the supply chain. And most of those projects that got built, all of them, had entered into purchase agreements for their wind turbines or their solar panels before COVID. So I'm running out of time here. I got to speed up the story.
Well, there's a lot to tell, Anne. You're doing great.
We, on behalf of our members, petitioned to the commission to have an inflation adjustment to a group of 86 contracts, because the price of building these projects had increased significantly from when they bid in to till now. And many of the projects were not getting built. Simultaneously, 2 offshore wind companies did the same for 4 offshore wind contracts. And it was a very involved and time-intensive and data-intensive process with the state of New York. And in the end, they decided not to grant that inflation adjustment and to instead do an expedited solicitation for new contracts. And that's where we stand today. So we're hoping, fingers crossed, that the state of New York on November 30th issues a new solicitation process for 2023, which should have been issued last April, so we're behind schedule on that. Takes bids from companies who are competing with each other to get one of these contracts, and then enters into a new batch of renewable energy contracts by the end of February for offshore wind and by April for land-based wind. So some conclusions in terms of where we are now based on that information. Given inflation, supply chain problems, how long it takes to get projects built in New York, and that decision I mentioned from the Public Service Commission, I would characterize reaching 70% by 2030 as in grave jeopardy. Not impossible, but seriously at risk because of all those pressures. What we need, and I would also say, though, that I'm very heartened by the state's announcement of this expedited solicitation process to try to get back on track. I do expect that many of the projects will cancel their contracts and rebid into this process. And NYCERTA has announced for offshore wind, it will pick 2 projects. And for land-based wind and solar, we don't know. But if those solicitations stay on the schedule they've announced, and then they get back on schedule of issuing another solicitation by Earth Day, it's possible that New York State could enter July, where they have what they're calling a mid-program review. How are we doing on 70 by 30? This was at the direction of the Public Service Commission, so that will start in July. We could potentially start July with enough projects under contract to get to 70% by 2030, and hopefully get back on projects starting construction. Right now, incidentally, I guess another piece of good news is if all the contracts got built for offshore wind, land-based wind, solar, and the transmission projects to deliver renewable energy in New York City, if all of those got built, that adds up to 79% of 2030 electricity demand. So it's a piece of good news, but we know that many of those contracts are underwater financially, and many of them will cancel, and some of them won't get built for other reasons. They might run into permitting problems, local opposition, can't get a tax agreement. There's a lot of risks to these projects. So New York really needs to double down on their procurement, get us back on schedule, and then on a parallel track, improve permitting, improve transmission, improve permitting of transmission, approve more transmission projects, and then address whatever pinch points and problems that will arise. From a non-governmental point of view, in order to be successful, we need folks like yourselves to vocally support the renewable energy projects in their neighborhood, to let your legislature know that you support renewable energy. We're going to be working on a bill this year called the Renewable Energy Progress Act to address some of the pinch points and problems. And I can't end without saying the other side of the equation, though, is reducing electricity demand. We want electricity demand to increase because we're buying electric cars and installing heat pumps, but we still need to weatherize and make our building envelopes more efficient in order to reduce peak demand for electricity. Because if we are to get to 70% by 2030, we need to build renewables, and we need to manage our demand for electricity as well. So Betta, I'll turn it back over to you, or actually, I think I was supposed to introduce Adrienne. Adrienne is the intrepid and tireless executive director of Citizens Campaign for the Environment, who does many, many things in the environmental arena on Long Island and across the state. But one of them lately has been advocating for offshore wind to serve the electricity demand of New York City and Long Island. So Adrienne, I will turn it over to you in your car.
Hello, everyone. I know. I'm sorry about this. My morning took a left turn, no pun intended. So thank you for having me, Betta. This is a wonderful forum. I'm going to talk about offshore wind because, as Anne said, we cannot meet our goals without offshore wind. But what could possibly be the difficulty? Well, I'm glad you guys asked. As Ann said, we currently have 5 offshore wind farms. There's some, kerflunk with will some of them proceed? And then another 3 were selected and announced recently for a total of 8 projects off of Long Island and in New York Bight. Those projects are to be connected to Long Island, Brooklyn, and Queens. So one of the things that we need is public support, because in the world of activism, which we are in, no true change ever happens without public support behind that change. But you know what? This is a big change. Changing the way we produce energy is a significant societal change. And I have to say, I don't think enough groundwork was laid in the minds of the public to have them understand and embrace such a big change. And one of the things we know for a fact, as agents of change, is that in the absence of the truth and science-based information, myths will spread. And alas, that's kind of what is happening here on Long Island. The polls show us, the internal polls, that 71% of the public supports offshore wind. But those are not the vocal people. The vocal people are the people who have decided they're against it. It's not a big percent. I want to be clear to all of you. I really am talking about the minority of voices, but they are very loud. And one of our big concerns, and one of the things we are working really hard to address, is the misinformation campaign that is going on across Long Island. I don't think it's so much in New York City, but it's definitely going on around Long Island. What could I mean? Well, there are 5 big things that people have questions about that we're working to answer. 1 is offshore wind's impact to whales. 2 is the cost of offshore wind. 3, does it work? 4 is the view shed. People don't want to interrupt their views of the beach. And the last one is the one that we get the most questions about, which is EMFs, electromagnetic fields. So I just want to mention to you, I've been to every public hearing and every community meeting on offshore wind over the last several years. I don't think we've missed one. And people have a lot of concerns about electromagnetic fields associated with the underground cable connections. Somehow it got into the public mind that this is new. We've never had a cable before connecting infrastructure that went from the ocean to the land. It's going to be underground. The electromagnetic fields will be causing cancer. And somebody just wrote the same 5G fear. Yes, that is absolutely correct. But we had to tell people, actually, it's not new. The ocean is actually riddled with underground cables for electric. Here on Long Island, we're 3 million people who live on an island, and not all of the electricity is generated on the island. Some comes from, hold on to your seat, cables. The largest one goes from New Jersey, goes under the Atlantic Ocean, and then pops up at Jones Beach. It's 660 megawatts. It's the Neptune cable. When I told people this, at first they didn't believe me, and then they Googled it, and then they said, well, this cable's bigger. So, we're working through with people to understand that cable connections are routine for energy infrastructure, and that we will not be made ill by them. The second thing that we have to deal with a lot is people say it costs too much. So it's really important, talking to the public, that we talk about comparisons. We have to juxtapose the cost of wind with the cost of continuing to be addicted to fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, coal also as well. I ask people, do you feel, and actually someone just texted me yesterday, well, you're not, the cost of oil is less. And I said, you know what, the cost of oil today is not going to be what the cost of oil is tomorrow, right? If you actually chart the cost of oil, particularly since COVID, on a chart, it's going to look like a heart attack patient, right? Goes up and down, up and down. couple of months ago, Saudi Arabia and Russia made a deal that they're going to restrict the amount of oil that flows because they want to drive the price up. So, if we're either going to be held hostage by nations that produce these fossil fuels, or we're going to be producing offshore wind as part of a strong part of our energy infrastructure. So there's the cost issue, which people seem to not understand, that we have to have a long-term plan because the cost of fossil fuels will go up. It is a finite resource. It's not really a dependable resource either. And offshore wind is not meant to be the sole source of our electric generation, but rather one substantive piece of the puzzle. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is we get so many questions about whales. And literally at every forum I do, and we do a lot of community forums, not just on wind, but it could be on drinking water, on whatever, inevitably somebody asked about the whales. And they say, I believe that every, marine scientist has said that the blasting from offshore wind is causing whale deaths. And we have to let them know that that is a false statement. And I don't think that they realize it's false. I think they've heard this repeatedly. We let them know that actually every marine mammal scientist, of which I've spoken to a half a dozen myself, have all agreed it's ship strikes, it is entanglement from commercial fishing gear, and it's also plastic pollution being consumed and ingested by whales and other marine mammals, causing marine mammals to die. So we have talked there is no blasting, but for surveying for offshore wind, sonar is used, and we've put together educational materials on this. So it's been very frustrating. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, but I do want to say it demonstrates the need that with any great societal change, there must be a robust, scientific-based public education and outreach campaign to engage the public, answer the public's questions, and really do that outreach. We've put together about 8 or 9 different 4- and 8-page little fact sheets about every different topic that people have asked questions about, including marine mammal impacts, climate change and sea level rise impacting New York and Long Island, and why offshore wind is a piece of that puzzle, and offshore wind and property values. Some people wanted to know if it was going to decrease their property values. But keep in mind, some people just don't know. This is new. We've had to explain to people that even though offshore wind is new to America, it's not new to the rest of the world. That Europe, China, not known for its forward-thinking environmental policies, and other nations are using offshore wind as a significant part of their energy mix. People generally seem very surprised to hear that. They really thought the technology was new since America hasn't used it. And for the most part, I would say 99.9% of the public has never even heard of the Block Island wind farm, which has been, generating electricity for Block Island for several years now. But it just wasn't on the radar screen. So what I wanted to just mention to you guys in summary is that, we're out there now in community meetings. We're doing Zoom forums just like this one. Betta did a great job putting this one together. Thank you for doing that. We have one that we're doing on Thursday. We have BOEM is speaking, NYCP is speaking, and the New York State DEC is speaking on that one. And it's called Why Wind Works. Again, we have, I think we have like 250 people already registered, and we're hoping, I'm actually circulating it into the opposition social media, which we monitor a great deal, hoping that they'll log on and really get firsthand from marine experts about what is wind, how does it work, what's the truth, what's the science-based truth. I know some people like to reject science in our new modern society here. But we are really working to do a much more aggressive campaign. I will say, I think one of the flaws in the process, and I'll stop talking, has been that both BOEM and NYCP required the industry to do all of the outreach. And while sometimes that sounds good, the public didn't really want to hear sometimes from the industry. They wanted to hear from impartial validators. So whether it's their elected officials, or whether it's the state agencies, or whether it's environmental groups, or some trusted validator, they wanted to hear from them and not necessarily from the industry. So some people have said, well, the industry didn't do a good job of reaching out. And I'm not even, that may or may not be true. But part of it is, and again, as someone who was in all those community meetings, anything the industry said, even when they're saying a fact-based comment, sometimes the public would outwardly reject that. So it has been it's been a big learning curve. We are working now to make the curve, go back on track. As some of us like to say, the path to success is not a straight line. It's filled with many curves and sometimes sharp angles, but we are working with the public to get the right information out there, and in a way that people will accept it and understand it and realize that wind really is a great hope of the future. And even if you can see them a little tiny bit on the horizon, we should view them as beacons of hope, or maybe kinetic art. And actually what I tell people, I'm like, but you can see the power plant, right? I mean, the power plants are these giant, ugly things. We see power plants, and yes, you may see a tiny bit of a wind farm on the horizon, but at least they're clean and safe for us, as opposed to our existing infrastructure. So that's what's going on with the public. Again, I just want to reiterate one thing Anne said. We do need voices to speak and speak out when there are public hearings and public meetings. So it's not all the myth, people coming out, but also some of you and some of the voices that understand the necessity of offshore wind and the viability of it as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. We love your passion and positivity. And that's exactly why we're having this, is to get more people engaged and support projects on the ground or in the sea, as the case may be. So I will now pass it over, and we will be happy to circulate a link to register for the event that you mentioned you're having on
thank you.
Group, of course. Absolutely. And any future opportunities for people to participate in upcoming events or, comment periods. Okay. So we always run out of time because there's so much to go over. But we'll get through it and hopefully get to everybody's questions. If not today, then we will capture all the questions in a Google Doc and get the answers for you and circulate it over email. So don't worry, you'll get your question answered. So next up is Luke Falk, who is the COO of Clean Path and for energyRe. And Luke's going to be talking about that project and the larger role of transmission, why it's so important to get Clean Path built as soon as possible and get these projects online. So I will turn it over to you, Luke.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. And thank you again, Beta, for providing a platform to educate people about what we're trying to do. Clean Path New York is a large clean energy infrastructure project being advanced by a public-private partnership that is comprised of two privately held companies. One is called energyRe, that's who I am with, and one is called Invenergy. Invenergy has a long track record of developing clean energy and renewable projects in New York and all over the world. And the public part of the partnership is the New York Power Authority, which owns a third of the bulk transmission system here in the state. And is the largest state municipal utility provider in the country. So, there was so much that Anne and Adrienne both spoke to that I just want to respond to. But before, because I think they're 100% right, I'm trying to situate for the audience where Clean Path fits into the whole discussion. So Adrienne was talking about offshore wind, which is obviously in New York, one of the few large-scale decarbonization solutions that the state can bring to bear to clean up the grid. Anne was talking about the large-scale renewable sector generally, which encompasses terrestrial wind and solar, which can also help, put a huge amount of clean energy into the network. CleanPath sort of sits in between those two concepts, both literally and figuratively. So our project is comprised of generation and transmission, which collectively represents a huge decarbonization solution in its own right to cleaning the grid in the downstate area. So the clean energy portion of it on the generation side, our project was initially comprised of 3,800 megawatts of new wind and solar scattered all across the state, developed by us and a whole network of other developers with whom we would interact to bring that power down to the downstate region via a 200-mile transmission line that is sort of the core of what we're trying to develop. And that transmission link is 1,300 megawatts of capacity, all underground or underwater. Where it's on land, it exclusively utilizes existing rights of way, whether that's being located underneath existing overhead transmission lines where we bury our power line underground, or in roadways or streets of some kind, in order to get this 200-mile route all the way from Delhi in the Western Catskills down into Queens in New York City. When we finish the project in 2027, it's going to be enough electricity to power 15% of the city's electricity use. It's going to reduce fossil fuel that is required to make electricity across the state today by over 20% every year, which is like taking 9 million cars off the road. But beyond that, it reduces all of the other harmful pollutants associated with electric generation, like NOx, SOx, and particulate matter 2.5, which are really the drivers of a lot of negative health outcomes in our frontline communities and beyond. And because we're going to be injecting our power into the part of New York City that we are injecting it into, there is a direct benefit for frontline communities that will see a vastly reduced runtime of the fossil fuel generation fleet in the city today. In addition to all of that good stuff, which is just an intrinsic benefit of the project itself, we create 8,300 jobs, all of which are located here in the state of New York. And the benefits part of the story is long and wonderful. One thing that I think this forum provides an opportunity to talk about is why transmission is important in the first instance. And so Anne alluded to it briefly. The reason why the project CleanPath New York came into being is because when the CLCPA was passed and there was a goal set of 70% renewables by 2030, there was a recognition at the state that more transmission needed to be brought online in order to deliver that outcome. And why is that the case? It's more pronounced in New York, I think, than in other jurisdictions, but it's a problem that's endemic to everywhere that was built on a fossil fuel paradigm. And that's the idea that, like, in the urban cores, generation was typically built proximal to the load center, so close by. As we move to renewables, that fuel source is like a little ever more distant, especially in New York, where the available land to build renewables is far away from New York City and Long Island. it's created this disparity in New York where upstate right now, it's 90% emissions free today because we have a lot of hydro, we have a lot of large scale renewables on the grid, whereas downstate is over 90% fossil fuel to provide electricity. And in order to get the whole state to a 70% renewable platform, what you need to do is connect that renewable resource upstate to the downstate load center. And so that's where our transmission line comes in. And that's like the genesis of the Tier 4 program that gave rise to Clean Path New York. Now, in addition to that, like irrespective of the CLCPA goals and our aspiration to have a cleaner grid, if you're paying attention to the reports that are coming out of the grid operator, the New York Independent System Operator, or what people call the NYCO, you'll see that because of a number of factors, there is an insufficient amount of generation capacity to serve all of the load across the state. They refer to it as thinning reliability margins over time. And so one of the benefits of additional transmission is that it unlocks the investment that the state is making in renewables, especially in the upstate territory, where there is, more development in the renewable space happening than in the downstate territory. To the extent that you can connect those downstate, you increase the efficacy of the state's investment. You unbottle curtailed renewables, which unless the state invests in more transmission will be more and more curtailed over time because the grid is only able to convey the amount of power that it can convey without additional support in additional transmission build out. So for all of these reasons, our project is, we think, hugely important. We're happy to be advancing it. We are in the middle of one of the elements that Anne talked about, or several of them in parallel. We have a contract with the state. We are in the middle of our permitting process, which is long and complicated, but I'll come back to that in a second. We are also advancing our interconnection with the grid operator, the NYCO. And so we're feeling really good about the state of the project. We've made a huge amount of progress in a short amount of time, and we look forward to delivering it on time. The final thing I'll say is like a couple of different things. Community outreach and engagement, as Adrienne was talking about, I think it cannot be overstated how important and impactful that is. We've endeavored to be out in front, talking to people like yourselves and community stakeholders all across the state as much as we possibly can about why the project is good, why renewable energy is good, why it will benefit the state overall. And I think we've been met with a really positive reception. I think people understand the idea of needing a connection for clean energy to power the most populated parts of our state. In addition to that, the final things that I'll say are that, we are committed to working with our friends in labor to make sure that huge projects like ours and our project itself, support a PLA, support collaboration with the unions. But beyond that, we've committed to undertaking a $270 million community investment fund to support things like workforce development, continuing education, increasing access to public health care in frontline communities and all across the state, and preserving the environment and stewarding environmental conservation wherever we can. And so I think I'll leave it there for the moment. As Anne pointed out, it is a fairly turbulent time in the renewable energy community, but we feel like the whole industry is more important than it's ever been. I think we have a key role to play in making it all come together, no pun intended, with our transmission link. And we look forward to working with everybody to advance it. I mean, the final thing that I'll say is that I think that the state should get a lot of credit for doing everything that it can do to continue to be a leader in this space. I think New York has held a leadership position vis-a-vis the rest of the country on this issue for quite some time. And I'm heartened by the fact that it seems like the state is as committed as it's ever been to seeing this project through, not just our project, but the project of renewable energy and clean energy broadly. And so we're happy to be a small part of that ecosystem. So thanks, Beta.
Thank you so much, Luke, and really glad to hear that you're optimistic about being on track for 2027. That's good news. So last but not least, we're going to hear from Dan Haas, who is on the ground with Friends of Columbia Solar. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you to let people know how they can help submit comments in this critical moment. And I think, Bryn, we may be good to go with our tool. So maybe Dan, you can talk a little bit about the project very briefly because we're running out of time. And Bryn, you can then introduce the tool that people can use if they want to submit a comment the easy way. Dan, are you still there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll be as succinct as I can. And yeah, this is exactly what we're all talking about, what's going on here in Copake. So I'm talking about Shepherd's Run, which is a 60 megawatt, 220 acre solar project proposed in Copake in 2020 was when it really got going. And it's important to know that, so Copake is a town of about 3,000 people. That's always been a farming town, but it's been changing quite a bit in recent decades. We're about 100 miles from New York City, which means that we have more and more laptop jobs are possible up here. So the population has been changing over from people who work locally to people who have jobs that are portable basically, and they tend to be very progressive politically, and they tend to be very environmentally conscious, but they also really value their view sheds, and that's kind of the nub of the conflict, I think. So many of those people are stridently opposed to this project. And also the town board, unfortunately, has been very adamantly against it. And the opposition is based on, number one is probably the argument that it takes away farmland, that we need to preserve farmland. Number two is probably, it happens to be, the project happens to be proposed at the headwaters of Taconic Creek, which is an important local stream, and water quality issues are a big topic that's raised. And third is one that's probably endemic to any of these projects, which is that the town resents having their laws overruled by the CLCPA, essentially, by ORES, which is part of the law. That relief can be given is the wording they use from local law. So let's see. Oh, and in connection with that, it's important to remember that the town of Copake actually filed a lawsuit against the CLCPA, which has now failed twice, but may be appealed again. They're trying to hamstring the entire law, which is, I won't get I won't get off on how that makes me feel, but so I'm a co-chair of Friends of Columbia Solar, as Beta said, and we formed about 3 years ago to support the project. We have lobbied politicians, we run tables at the farmers market, we write editorials and letters to the editor, and just do everything we can to try to move the project forward, and working pretty closely with Hecate, the developer. Let's see, and where the project has gone, the basic history, what's been going on is the application from Hecate to ORES has been turned down 3 times as incomplete, until a big turning point was reached in October when they issued a draft permit. So right now we're in the process of there is a draft permit issued, which makes us all very optimistic. It begins another process that involves public comments. And that's where I'm appealing to everybody to help us out by doing whatever you can in terms of comments, and I'll detail that in a minute. But I just want to underscore why this project is particularly important. it really is kind of a test case for the CLCPA and the ORES process, the 94C process in a really, we're essentially a downstate community being 100 miles from the city. You know, as is mentioned, many of these projects are much further upstate, and opposition is going to be a lot tougher, I think, in these areas. So this is a really important example. If we can get this one built, it shows that even though there's maybe a lot of local opposition, we can still move forward. Let's see. Yeah, so I was just gonna kind of pass on what I heard most recently from Hecate, the developer. They feel like they're close to success with this project. His metaphor was kind of on the 20-yard line, but don't want to fumble now. And there is some concern that if there's really a great outpouring of local opposition at the public hearings that are scheduled in January, that might sway the administrative law judge who will be overseeing the hearings. And we just really feel it's very important to get as many positive, supportive comments for the project out there as we can. And I'll underscore, you don't have to live in Copiague. It probably, your comment probably has more impact if you live in Copiague, but anybody who lives in New York State, you know, really should be happy to comment on this, because it really is, as everybody's been saying, this is a statewide, really, of course, you know, a global issue that we're talking about. So let's see. Yeah, I'll just finish up by kind of referring to Melissa to exactly how you can use the tool that has been developed to generate comments. And just to be clear, there's really 3 things that can be done. I expect most people will be able to post comments on the state website. There will be public hearings in January, and also virtual hearings online in January. And I won't go through all the dates because it's all in the tool. But if anybody, you know, wants to come down to Copiague, it's a beautiful town. We'll find a way to put you up. If you want to show up at the town hall on January 9th and 10th and speak up, more than welcome. If you can do it virtually, that's another possibility. But it really is a critical time. We all feel with Friends of Solar that if we can get enough positive comments at these hearings coming up, that we'll get past the finish line, and this will be 60 more megawatts that will be added to the grid. So thanks. And so Melissa, can you explain where we're at with the tool?
We're actually going to pass it to Bryn Fullerbecker, our communications manager, to talk about the tool.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again so much for being here and for taking action with us. So we have been working at New Yorkers for Clean Power to develop a tool that makes it very easy for you to not only submit a comment and express your support for the project, but also prepare for the upcoming hearings for that. So I'm going to share the link now to take action, and you'll just fill out your information and it'll send an email directly to the recipients that are receiving public comments, and has a template email that you can use. You can customize it to express your support for the project. So I just put the link in the chat. I'll say this too with the caveat that the existing powers that be do not make it easy for you all to express your support. So if you run into any issues or any bugs like that, please just let us know, but we'll send this link as a follow-up. We'll be tracking progress on our end to make sure that all of your comments are being submitted. And we'll also have plenty of ways after today to take action. But for the meantime, click that link, submit your comment, and we're happy to help you with every step along the way to make sure that you all can express your support for this very important and powerful project. So thanks so much, Dan, for giving us the context for that. And yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out with any questions or concerns.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Bryn, for putting that together, and Dan, for all of your great advocacy. It's, as we've been hearing, it's critically important that people in communities and on the ground show their support for these projects. So really appreciate it. And we will follow up with everybody with a link to that take action if you aren't capturing it now, as well as this recording and a Google Doc with questions with answers. And many of your questions, I think, have already been answered in the chat, which is great. But I did see one that I wanted to highlight because I feel like a lot of people have this question. And this is from Elizabeth Henderson. There's so much non-ag land where solar should be sited or could be sited all along the thruway for starters. Why take farmland? Cheaper? And I could take a crack at this, but I think Anne, you could probably do a better job at answering it. And I'm sure you get this question a lot too. So
yeah, sure, I can try. So first off, where solar can go is really limited by where there's transmission system access. And I know that sounds like a very obvious point, but I think it does get forgotten a lot when people are suggesting specific locations. Second, the way these projects are selected. So these companies develop a project, which, costs maybe $3 million or so to start the permitting process, enter into land agreements for lease options with the landowners. They do not purchase the land, they lease it from the landowners and pay them an annual payment for having the solar panels there, etc. And then once the project reaches a certain point in development, it bids into NYCP to try to get a contract. And NYCP picks projects based on cost, 70%, and then 30% on other factors. And so all these developers are balancing these things. Is it cheaper often to build on land that is flat, for example? Yes. And it works better with having, the panels get the same amount of sunlight, etc. They have to avoid wetlands. And they don't legally have to avoid forested lands, but it often is very controversial to cut down trees. So those are the factors that they're weighing. And so it ends up that some of the projects are on agricultural land. NYCP addressed this by saying you get extra points in your application if you avoid prime soils, the most valuable agricultural land. And since they have, in the years that they've done that, the amount of proposed projects on prime soil has been reduced. And then if there's still projects on prime soils, they have to pay a mitigation fee, which is like $1 per acre amount, unless they do agrivoltaics on those locations. And so more and more as these projects start to get built, you're going to start to see, in my view, first off, avoiding agricultural land, and then if they can't avoid it, having some sheep grazing or crops underneath. So there's systems, there's policy levers in place to try to get solar panels avoiding prime soils. But with the amount of solar we have to build and limitations of the grid, there are going to be some projects that are going to be on agricultural land. Hopefully that answered the question.
Thanks, Anne. That was great. And I see Lisa's chiming in too. Luke, if you're still there, we had a question about the $270 million community fund that you mentioned, and if there's a solicitation process or criteria. And then we also had another question for you about whether Clean Path New York is considered in-city generation, which I'm guessing no, but
yeah, so let me take those in sequence. There is not yet a process to access the Community Investment Fund. We're in the process of constituting that mechanism now. We will keep in touch with Beta or anybody else who wants to contact us. We have an info form on our website, which is cleanpathny.com. You can get in touch with us there. We have a hotline that, we respond to every day if you want to leave us a message. Also, we're active on Instagram, which, a lot of people use. Our handle is @cleanpathny. So you can get in touch with us, and we'll always be communicative about how to put you in touch with funds when they become available. The second question, is CleanPath considered in-city generation? It depends on from what lens you are looking, but we are a capacity resource that will arrive in Zone J. I think from system planning perspective, our capacity is considered in-city capacity for the purpose of local law 97. If you're talking about, could you use the emissions-free power from CleanPath New York as a mechanism through which to comply with local law 97, in broad strokes, yes, because we are directly injected, as the law says, into Zone J. And in fact, that's one of the great aspects of the CleanPath project, is that, all our RECs, our renewable energy credits that we sell to the state, will be turned around and can be sold to building owners to the extent that they are motivated to procure those RECs for whatever reason, including potentially compliance with the law. We think that that's a great way to connect building owners to clean energy, and to provide a funding mechanism that is not solely on the basis of being a ratepayer, but building owners that want to procure RECs will be paying the state for those RECs, and that's a great way to support clean energy as well.
Thanks, Luke. And Chris had a question. Chris Carrick, is it true that there's a proposal in New Jersey to build in inflation into offshore wind bids? Can Anne speak to that idea here in New York?
So I think so about New Jersey, but I don't know for sure. But in New York, NYCP already decided to provide an inflation adjustment as an option for the companies. So the new projects that were just announced, the 3 offshore wind companies, when they bid, they had that option. They could include a bid with an inflation adjustment at the time of construction. Same for the upstate wind and solar projects. Though I assume that they all took that option, but technically I don't know, because the contracts haven't been made public yet. They were just announced in October. So the fact that New York recognized the inflation problem and included it for new projects was one of the reasons we came to the conclusion that we were going to go to the commission and ask for that inflation adjustment for past projects, to which their answer was no. But they certainly recognize that inflation is the problem, given how long it takes from when you bid to when you start to build.
Thanks, Anne. I think we should wrap it up because we're 7 minutes over, and I know that people have other meetings and things to get to, but really appreciate everybody's time, our wonderful speakers, all of the incredible advocacy and organizing that everyone is doing so that we can achieve our 70 by 30 goals and all of our other goals that are in our climate plan. Let's make it happen. And also want to give a plug for our next online teach-in, which is going to be December 15th at noon, and that's going to be focused on the New York Heat Act, which has been our top legislative priority related to equitable building decarbonization and getting off gas in buildings and protecting people from rate hikes. So it's an important piece of legislation. We hope to get over the finish line very soon, and we'll be taking a deep dive into that on the 15th. In the meantime, look out for your email. We're going to send around a recording from this. If you want to watch it again or share with anybody, as well as a Google Doc with all of the questions and answers and comments that people made. We so appreciate everybody's great questions and thinking and sharing your thoughts and ideas, and hope to see you again very soon. Please reach out if you want to get more involved with any of this or connect to any of our speakers. That's what we're here for, is to promote connection and collaboration.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Adrienne and Luke.
Thank you.
And Dan and everybody. Take
Welcome.
care.